Visit the charm of old-school comics. Times like this have become a rare occasion for Eddie Yap. But when the 67-year-old starts flipping through his collection of vintage comics, he usually finds himself immersed in memories of yesteryear.
Now these years, we have modern comics, the drawings, everything is all so good, immaculate. But somehow there's just something of this old school thing that has a magic in them.
Comics came into Eddie's life when he was just 6 years old in the early 1950s. They were his father's way of giving the youngest of his 4 children a special treat.
He would bring us to Rex Theatre, or usually on a Saturday night, and the 9:30 p.m. show. And just before the show starts, we always go to a mama shop just beside Rex Theatre, and that guy sells all the comics there.
Caricature and cartoons were a feature of local newspapers as early as the late 40s. They were typically socio-political in nature, using humor to comment on the issue of the day. By the 80s, comics became a tool for storytelling. For Eddie, comics is a way for him to strengthen connections.
Kids nowadays can just zip everywhere, to find out about things. But the bond between the father and the son, if you have something, like comics, you can still relate to them. And there's a bond there, you see.
Eddie's son, Brighton Yap, was introduced to comics when his father's collection was discovered as they were moving house in 1980.
Back then, most of us were playing video games, But what I experienced from the comics was a little bit different because I could see how, in the 1960s, the art and how people were living their lives back then. I didn't know how my parents lived during that time, what they did for entertainment. So that was my way of connecting with them.
Brighton has built on his father's collection, tracking down missing issues while discovering old-school marvels. Today, he has a collection of about 10,000 comics that's worth around 78,000 Singapore dollars. For Brighton, the money spent on vintage comics is well worth it.
We like to preserve what we used to enjoy and what we don't have anymore, because the simplicity of life back then was different. We didn't have television, we didn't have computers, so that's what got me started also.
Before the 80s, local cartoonists did not create story-based comics. Their works were usually drawn on a single frame or a 4-panel comic template. For a greater variety, Bill Teo turned to comics imported from overseas.
They were so limited in activity. That's why I say I started reading Beano, Dandy, and Desperate Dan from Britain. And because there were not enough comics to go around, if I miss one issue, I have to really desperately run to the next store, and hope he has. Because at that time, all these stores, so I think at the most, they brought in 1 or 2 pieces of that comic. And they spoil the comics because the first thing they do is stamp their company stamp on the comic.
The popularity of comics in Singapore surged in the late 80s. In 1986, Comics 880 was founded. Besides being the pioneer comics publication in Singapore, they were also the first to use comic art to tell stories. Bill opened his comic book shop during this period and found great success. But still, comic reading was a rare sight in public.
They probably buy home and read. But in Japan, it's a different story. In Japan, 90+% of people read comics. So everywhere you see somebody holding a manga.
From the late 80s to the 90s, many began speculating on the future value of comics.
I warn them, it's not a game to play with, because the bubble will burst and eventually burst. And so those fellows who had collected multiple copies found themselves practically their savings gone because the value dropped. And that kind of thing killed the industry a bit.